Welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. We've been talking about marriage and family related topics and how they intersect with economics the last few months. And one that I've been getting asked a lot about, and I've been curious about the math on this, is what income levels does it make sense to have a stay at home wife? And more really, what income level does a stay at home wife need to be able to get at a job for her to make sense to work? This is a pressing question because in very high cost of living cities, or just in general in America, the cost of childcare has accelerated rapidly. And it's changed the math on the viability of having a two income household with children. Having the second income usually outweighed any costs of childcare or school or a variety of other implicit costs involved in needing the mother at home. But as the quality of public education has declined in most of the United States, and as the cost of daycares and hiring nannies and babysitters or childcare has increased rapidly, it is changing the math on what makes sense to have a two income household or a one income household. I'm mostly going to refer to this as stay at home wives, not because you can't have stay at home husbands or anything like that, but it's just that I know that 87% of the audience of this channel is men. And so that's what's going to be more relatable to them. So without further ado, let's get started. There's a lot of different scenarios here, but we have to have a few key assumptions for things to make sense. Assumption number one is that you need to have still a second car. Like, it'd be very difficult to have a one income household and one car when you have children, because what are you going to do? Take your kids to the doctor in Ubers, and go to the grocery store, run errands in Ubers every day? That can really add up, especially if you want to take children with you. Logistically, it's kind of a mess. So that's assumption number one. Assumption number two, that you will be hiring some help. Theoretically, if only one child, maybe a stay at home mother can handle it herself. But I mean, that's very stressful. Have to deal with a kid 24/7, even with a husband's help. And sometimes both parents need a break. So even in the stay at home scenarios, I'm assuming when there's younger kids that the family will be hiring a babysitter for at least 15 hours a week. And that could go down with older children, of course. But the third scenario that I am assuming for the older children scenario, the third assumption here is that the kids will either go to private school, or they'll be paying, or the parents will be paying an equal amount in increased housing costs to move to a better school district, the public schools. So that's a wash. That might be a little bit of a bold assumption, but I think it's a fair one. And then the fourth assumption I have built into this, and you could adjust this with your own models if you want. And things I've considered, maybe I should make like a calculator for this that I could offer to people. If that's interesting, you like to have a calculator on whether it makes sense to have a two or one income household with a family, let me know. I might put one together and offer it for subscribers. I'm assuming that for this case, that the partner who does work has a $200,000 a year income, which in California puts you at a little bit over the 30% tax bracket for a married couple. And in Florida, it puts you closer to the 25% bracket. And so that is going to be my assumption. You could change it based on your own tax rate. If it's a higher tax rate, you're going to have to raise the required amount of income that makes sense for a stay-at-home mother to work. If there's a lower income person, let's say it only makes 100,000, then they'll be in a much lower tax bracket, and therefore the amount of money needed for working to make sense. The fifth thing is that I'm assuming the working spouse would want a return on her investment for working. I don't think it's going to make sense for somebody to go to work if they just break even. They're going to want some sort of return on their human capital. And I'm going to put a 20% kicker on this, because that 20% is the return on human capital that you're getting paid after tax above what you would have to spend on increased expenses involving being willing to work. So our core assumptions are second car, either paying more for a house in a higher school district or private schools. You're going to have a babysitter. He'll have more hours of a babysitter if you work, but you'll have a minimum amount of hours of a babysitter. And there's going to be some sort of demand on return on investment. Some career women actually don't mind breaking even or even taking a slight loss because they consider an investment on their careers. But to assume that everybody would want that, I think would not really be appropriate. So let's first break down the scenario. There's a lot of difference also on the number of kids. Like one kid going through all of this is a lot lower cost than two kids. And actually, I have to make a correction. It's not 30% for the California 200K couple, it's 35%. The other assumption I'm making is that the husband either has health insurance at his company or paying for it. If the husband is self-employed and doesn't have health insurance, then you need to lower all these income levels by about $24,000 because the average cost of a family healthcare plan without subsidies that has to be paid out of pocket because the husband is self-employed is about $24,000 a year for a family of four. So two parents and two kids. And if the stay-at-home mom takes a job that offers health insurance for the family, just subtract 24,000 across the board for all of these assumptions. In our first scenario, we are talking about a family with children under the age of 6. So they're either in preschool, newborns, babies, or toddlers. If you have a stay-at-home wife, the only additional cost in this scenario is hiring the nanny for 10 to 15 hours a week. And at $25 an hour, that is an extra $250 to $375 a week. And really, from a yearly basis, assuming the nanny works 50 weeks a year and gets 2 weeks off, that's about $12,500 a year you would be spending on that. And whereas if you are a working mother, you are going to hire the nanny for, instead of 10 to 15 hours a week, 40 hours a week. So that 12,500 a year going towards childcare, if you decide to hire somebody internally, is going to go up to at least $50,000 a year and possibly $60,000 a year. That's probably before payroll taxes or any other additional expenses that might need to be covered given that level of income that you are spending on such a level of help. The other option is daycare. Depending where you live, daycare is anywhere from $300 to $500 a week per child. Let's just say $400 a week. That's $1,600 a month that you're going to be spending on daycare, which is $19,200 per year out of pocket. And then there are other costs involved with a job. I'm assuming you're going to have a second car anyway. So that's not one of them, but it's things like having to go out to eat more versus cooking at home, hiring more help for other domestic causes, having to spend more on commuting costs, such as gas or repairs for the car, or if you have an electric car, charging, and buying special work clothes, eating out to lunch, etc. And let's just say all of these other ancillary work-related expenses add up to about $8,000 a year, or about $700 a month, so $8,400 a year. And so you have to factor that in. You have to factor in taxes because every marginal dollar you're gaining from the job is not a marginal dollar. That marginal dollar is only 65 cents. That also impacts this trade-off quite a bit. But for one child, the income level where this trade-off starts to make sense is still pretty low. The break-even really number is about $55 $100,000 a year net in California, and a zero tax state like Florida and Texas, that number goes down to about $46,000 a year. And let's just say we add the 20% premium, so there's an actual return on your human capital. So that would increase the 46K in Florida to 55K approximately, and would increase the 55K to $66,000 a year. So basically, in order for it to make sense, really, for this your stay-at-home wife to work after one under six kid, the income it needed is about $66,000 per year, assuming that the husband is earning about 200,000. And I place that because that's like the high end of the middle class range. I generally think the middle class range for income is 50,000 on the low end to 200,000 on the high end. And then let's go into the next level, which is instead of one child, you have two children. The thing is with kids, especially things like daycare and college and school, there might not be economies of scale. I know there's some Catholic schools that have sibling discounts and daycares have sibling discounts, but they're not common enough or they're not big enough to really have some material economics of scale here. When you have two kids versus one kid, now you're spending, instead of $400 a week, you are spending $750 a week. So you do have somewhat of a sibling discount, but $750 a week times four, that's $3,000 a month now that you're spending on daycare. The full-time nanny is about the same cost, but it's still a little bit more expensive than daycare. And let's just assuming the ancillary costs of working are still the same. So now the break even, instead of at one child, it has increased now to at two children. The break even is $65,000 per year. And that is before the required return that we're having on this. So if you have an ROI requirement of 20% on your human capital, that 65K now goes up to $78,000 a year. So if your income is more than $78,000 per year working, it makes more sense for the mother to work. And again, I'm doing this as purely economic and stuff. There might be other reasons, like in terms of being close to a family, less stress, or other personal reasons why somebody would want to either work or stay home, or you're passionate about your career or want to be able to advance up the ladder. So this is purely from a financial perspective. But the break even now for two kids is about $65,000 per year. Let's do three kids. Three kids will increase the magnitude a little bit higher, but there are some economies of scale, so it's not perfectly proportionate. So now the break even, instead of being around 65K per human capital premium, now closer to about 90,000 a year before human capital premium. And if we add a 20% kicker, it's $108,000 a year. A stay-at-home mom needs to make $108,000 a year or more at a job in order for a financial perspective to have it make more sense to work than stay at home with the kids. The other option is a part-time option, which can work, where you have a private practice or you have enough of a skills that you can generate enough hourly work to offset the costs of the nanny or bring in some extra income. The wage needs to be above $35 an hour in a zero federal tax state and $40 an hour and a high state income tax state like California. So let's just say if you work $40 an hour freelancing or private practice and you work about 10 hours a week, that adds an extra $400 a week or $1,600 a month, which basically can cover a large chunk of the bill for the nanny because you're paying $15 an hour at 25. And so kind of cancels each other out. The upside here for the part-time work more than from a money sense is it creates a source of intellectual stimulation. It gets rid of the resume gap problem that you can still continue to develop your skills and be considered an active member of the workforce, even if you're scaling down your hours to focus more on raising children. If you have this little bit of extra time to use towards work to keep yourself sharp, if you did want to pursue going back to a career full time when the kids are at school age, this could be a good way to make that transition easier while also helping with financial costs. It might be hard to fit in 10 hours a week when you have newborns, but those 10 hours could be done when the father's at home and can pick up the slack, or it could be the time that you use to hire the full-time or part-time nanny to help. So there's ways it can be done. This would gross about $20,000 an hour if you did the $40 an hour, 10 hours a week for a whole year, whereas you're paying the nanny $15K, but after taxes, it's really close to a wash. The break evens are about 40 to 55K for one child, counting the 20% ROI for labor. Like if you don't count it, it's 35K for one child, 65K for two, 90 for three. And if you want to have a return on human capital, it's about 42,000 for one child. You have about 78,000 for two and 108,000 for three. Now let's go to scenario 2, which is older children, school age, 6 and above. You have two options here. One, have a stay-at-home parent involved in homeschooling, or you can have a working mother and you send the kids to either private school or you move to a school district that has good public schools, but the extra housing costs equal essentially the cost of private school. And so in a world where the public school system is consistently being degraded, it's going to require a more wealthy and more exclusive neighborhood to find the few public schools that are still good. And that's kind of my base assumption here. The math differs whether you decide to go to conventional private school versus parochial Catholic schools. The Catholic schools tend to be much more cost affordable. Like the average Catholic school in California, for example, is anywhere from $9,000 a year to $15,000 a year. In Florida, it's about 8 to 14. So let's just say it's going to be about $12,000 a year per kid for a Catholic school. Whereas secular and Protestant and or Jewish private schools tend to be much more expensive. Non-Catholic private schools tend to average about $23,000 a year. And some wealthier areas like Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, these are well over 30 to even above 40,000 level a year, like almost college tuition. And so I'm not going to go with those assumptions. I'm just going to use the baseline of like the national average of about 23,000 a year to see when it makes sense to have a stay-at-home homeschooling mother versus sending the kids to private school. And I'm going to use California and Florida kind of as the examples again, because it's a high tax state. Because that's the difference between a high tax state and a low tax state. So yeah, let's first start if you have one school-aged child. If you have one school-aged child, the cost benefit analysis in terms of break even is about 39K if you send a kid to a Catholic school and $55,000 per year if you send them to a private school that's non-Catholic. At that level, the salary is going to cover the tuition and a little bit of extra help. The other assumption I'm making is that if you're a stay-at-home mom, you have school-age kids, you no longer really need the nanny anymore. But if you are going to be sending the kids to school and you're going to be working full-time, you'll need the nanny for after-school hours, about 10 to 15 hours a week. And so that's the other cost factor in addition to the regular incidental costs of working. minus the cost of daycare or a much longer time for nannies. In this case, the break even for one kid school age is 39 to 55,000. That's for the 20% human capital kicker. If you had a 20% human capital kicker, that range increases from 48 to $66,000 a year, which is pretty low. In general, what I've noticed from this research is if you only have one child, more often than not, it makes sense to have both parents work. The economy of having a stay-at-home wife starts to go up once you have two or more children. For two children, let's just say you have two kids you're sending to Catholic school or two kids you're sending to non-Catholic school, and the work extras are the same like everything else, and the babysitter expenses are the same. So now with two kids, the cost of sending the kid to private school versus homeschooling has still increased. Instead of the break even being in the 60s K per year, it's a little bit higher. So now the range is 50 to 90K, depending on whether you're sending them to Catholic schools. Actually, let me correct that. It's 56,000 to 90K gross prior to the human capital kicker. So if you add the 20% human capital kicker to both of these numbers go up from 56,000 to about 69,000 and from 90,000 to $108,000 per year, where it makes sense to send two kids to private school instead of having a stay-at-home homeschooling mom. Now, let's go to the third example, which is three children. With three children, you have another layer of tuition. And you probably have one in high school, which is higher tuition. It's like 15K instead of the elementary level, which is 9 to 12K. Modern day, even here, is above 20, I think, now in Orange County. It's Metro Santa Maria, I bet it's probably similar, but I haven't checked. You sum those up, you're now spending about 33 to 36,000 a year just in private school tuition for Catholic school. For non-Catholic school, it's probably going to be $70,000 a year just in tuition. You still have all the incidental work expenses and the babysitter. So now the break-even income is $80,000 for Catholic schools before human capital kicker, and $130,000 for a non-Catholic private school. If we add a 20% human capital required return for this, that's $96,000 for the Catholic schools. And for the private schools, it's added $156,000 a year. So basically, if you want to have three or more kids and school age kids and not homeschool them and send them to private schools instead, the cost now increases to a six-figure job that is needed. And there's another option here, which is the part-time work again, except now you don't have to do only 10 hours a week because the kids are in school most of the day. You can do 25 hours a week. And let's just say you work for $40 an hour for 25 hours a week. That's $1,000 a week. That's $4,000 a month. That would cover a serious dent on the tuition even after taxes. And you don't have to pay the nanny anymore, the 12K. So like the tax downside is kind of wiped out by no longer having the cost of the nanny. It's basically on the margin adding an extra $36,000 towards the school. So if we have one kid, part-time work could easily be the break even for private school. If you have two kids, it might not completely cover it. If it's Catholic school, it can cover it entirely. But if it's non-Catholic school, maybe cover 2/3 of it. And if you have three kids, They'll still cover most of it for Catholic school, like over 70%, but for private school, it might not make it to that level. So it really seems like the most optimal outcome is the private practice freelancing type path. You could always go back to corporate America by maintaining your skill set, but you still have the freedom and personal flexibility and have less childcare costs that way, but still be able to pay for the school. These also adjust with income brackets. If the husband is making less money, the amount of money that the wife needs to make for her to make sense to work goes down proportionally due to being a lower tax bracket. If you're in a higher tax bracket, the amount of money a woman needs to make to be financially profitable increases, which is why, other than social reasons, there's a real economic reason why women who marry wealthier husbands tend to work less. It's not solely a status or ability thing. It's just that, like, from a dollars and cents point, it just economically makes less sense. So for a moderately higher end of middle class income, like a 200K income, it still has to have a relatively high second income for the second income to make sense. The part-time scenario seems to be the one that tends to make the most sense in both scenarios from an economic perspective and probably also from a life fulfillment perspective to a certain degree, whether you have young children or school-age children. In terms of the other kind of key assumption, though, for both the part-time option and full-time option is that the spouse is educated and can get a job that pays sufficiently high enough or has skills that can freelance for a rate that is sufficiently high. The type of people where it makes the most sense to have a full-time stay-at-home mom are either a spouse that has relatively low earnings potential, like a ceiling in their career that's maybe lower than $80,000 a year in today's dollars, or have a current income that is lower than $50,000 a year. That's kind of where it seems to make the most sense. Where it makes the least sense are for career trajectories that are over $150,000 a year US and have peak earnings a year above 180 to 200,000. That's where the math starts to make less sense. And again, this is purely from an economic perspective for a stay-at-home wife. There might be personal, spiritual, or cultural reasons why a couple might want to have a more traditional arrangement. But looking at just from a financial sense, that's kind of the income ranges. So basically, the in between, say, the 50 to the 150K a year range of income potential, that's where you can be a lot more flexible. And it's also assuming that the husband's job or business covers health insurance. If it doesn't, you lower those minimum break-even incomes by 24,000, assuming the job covers health insurance. So that's kind of seems to be and if you want to have 4 or more kids, then the stay-at-home path makes a lot more sense. With smaller families, like 1 to 2 kids, dual income households make a lot more financial sense. Whereas when you have larger families, they make less sense because the kids do have some economies of scale, but they're not big enough that the marginal costs continue to accelerate. So the bottom line is, what is the value of a stay-at-home wife? Well, it depends on where you live, but generally it's about 50 to 150K a year is the equivalent for what she is doing for you on the open market. Hopefully this gives you some food for thought. Based on my analysis here, for the married couples out there, those who are getting married or looking to have kids, do you want a stay-at-home wife who's going to be a full-time mom or not? What are your reasons for or against? If you want a stay-at-home girlfriend or a stay-at-home wife and have no children, there's really no reason for that scenario whatsoever. Because one, the marginal costs, there's no real costs such as daycare, school that take away from the profitability of working. I just think it's good for people to do something outside the house. But in general, so that's kind of the kind of the thing that's unsaid, but kind of said at the same time. There's really no income level from a purely economic perspective where a stay-at-home wife or stay-at-home girlfriend, which is the TikTok trend, that there's no children involved really ever makes sense, assuming that there's no health problems that prevent the stay-at-home spouse from working. Let me know what you think of this. Hopefully you learned something from it. And if you like these kind of deeper dive mathematical breakdowns of certain personal financial decisions, let me know. If you have questions about your financial planning needs, feel free to contact me through the pinned comment or links in the description. Thank you for watching.